Hi, and welcome to the What Sleep podcast, where we talk about all the things that'll keep you up at night. My co host and I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you want to see more about this case, check out our socials where we post pictures of all the cases we talk about. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook at What Sleep Podcast, and you can find us on Twitter at What Sleep Pod. Today, we're going to be talking about Sylvia Likens. So, this whole thing kind of takes place between the years of 1949 and 1965. But before we get into Sylvia Likens, we're going to go ahead and talk about Gertrude Baniszewski. Totally butchered that name. I'm not bad, or I'm not good at pronunciations of names. So Gertrude, born in Indianapolis, Indiana, to Molly Myrtle and Hugh Marcus Van Fossen Sr., both of whom were originally from Illinois and were of American and Dutch descent. Baniszewski was the third of six children, and her family was working class. October 5th, 1939, Gertrude saw her 50-year-old father die from a sudden heart attack. 6 years later, she dropped out of high school at age 16 to marry 18-year-old John Stefan Baniszewski, who was originally from Youngsville, Pennsylvania, and to whom she bore four children. Although John had a volatile temper and occasionally beat his wife, the two would remain together for 10 years prior to their first divorce. Following her divorce, Gertrude married a man named Edward Guthrie. This marriage lasted just 3 months before the couple divorced, and shortly thereafter, Gertrude remarried her first husband, bearing him two more children. The couple divorced for a second time in 1963. Weeks after her third divorce, Gertrude began a relationship with a 22-year-old named Dennis Lee Wright, who also physically abused her. Not very good at choosing men, clearly. She had one child with Wright, Dennis Lee Wright Jr., and shortly after the birth of his son, Wright abandoned Gertrude. And shortly thereafter, Gertrude filed a paternity suit against Wright for financial support of their child, although Wright was seldom able to pay for the upkeep of their son. By 1965, Gertrude lived alone with her seven children, got their names and their ages: Paula, who was 17, Stephanie, who was 15, John, who was 12, Mary, who was 11, Shirley, who was 10, James, who was 8, and Dennis Lee Wright Jr., who was 1. Although 36 years old and 5 feet 6 inches in height, she weighed only 100 pounds and has been described as a haggard, underweight asthmatic. She was a chain smoker suffering from depression due to the stress of 3 failed marriages, a failed relationship, and a recent miscarriage. In addition to the sporadic checks she received from her first husband, a former Indianapolis policeman, which she primarily relied upon to financially support her children, Gertrude occasionally performed odd jobs for neighbors and acquaintances, such as sewing or cleaning, in order to earn money. Gertrude resided in Indianapolis at 3850 East New York Street, where the monthly rent was $55. Now we'll kind of get more into Sylvia. Sylvia was born on January 3rd of 1949, and she was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers Lester Cecile Likens and his wife Elizabeth Betty Francis. She was born between two sets of fraternal twins, Daniel and Deanna, 2 years older than she was, and Benny and Jenny, who were 1 year younger. Jenny Likens suffered from polio, causing one of her legs to be weaker than the other. She was afflicted with a notable limp and had to wear a steel brace on one leg. Lester and Elizabeth's marriage was unstable, and they often sold candy, beer, and soda at carnival stands around Indiana throughout the summer, moving around frequently and regularly experiencing severe financial difficulties. The Likens' sons regularly traveled with their parents in order to help out, but due to concerns for their younger daughters' safety and education, They didn't particularly like Sylvia and Jenny traveling with them in this employment. Both girls frequently resided with relatives, often their grandmother, so that their schoolwork would not suffer while their parents and brothers traveled with the carnival. In her teenage years, Sylvia Likens occasionally earned spending money by babysitting, running errands, or performing ironing chores for friends and neighbors, often giving her mother part of her earnings. She has been described as a friendly, confident, and lively girl with long, wavy, light brown hair extending below her shoulders and was known as Cookie to her friends. Odd little nickname. I don't think I've ever heard a nickname like that. Although exuberant, Sylvia always kept her mouth closed when smiling due to having lost a front tooth in a collision with one of her brothers during a childhood game. She also had a fondness for music, in particular the Beatles, and was notably protective of her markedly more timid and insecure younger sister. On several occasions, the two sisters would visit a local skating rink where Jenny would fasten a single roller skate to her strong foot and Sylvia would lead her by the hand and they skated around the rink. That's cute. That's some good sister stuff right there, man. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny resided with their parents in Indianapolis. On July 3rd, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. And shortly thereafter, Lester Likens arranged for his daughters to board with Gertrude, the mother of two girls with whom the sisters had recently become acquainted while studying at Arsenal Technical High School, Paula and Stephanie. At the time of this boarding agreement, Gertrude assured Lester she would care for his daughters until his return as if they were her own children. Shortly after the July 4th holiday, the sisters moved into 3815 East New York Street in order for their father and later their mother to travel to the East Coast with the carnival, with the understanding that Gertrude would receive weekly boarding fees of $20 to care for their daughters until they returned to collect Sylvia and Jenny in November of that year. During the initial weeks in which Sylvia and Jenny resided at the Baniszewski household, the sisters were subjected to very little discipline or abuse. Likens regularly sang along to pop records with Stephanie, and she willingly participated in housework. Both girls also regularly attended Sunday school with the Baniszewski children. I know I keep changing the way I'm pronouncing that, but I just, I'm bad. Although Lester had agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week in exchange for the care of his daughters, these weekly payments gradually failed to arrive exactly upon the prearranged dates, occasionally arriving 1 or 2 days late. In response, Gertrude began venting her frustration at this fact upon the sisters in a not so great way. She would beat them with various instruments, such as a 1/4 inch thick paddle, making statements such as, quote, "Well, I took care of you two little bitches for a week for nothing." On one occasion in late August, both girls were beaten approximately 15 times on the back with the, previously mentioned paddle after Paula had accused the sisters of eating too much food at a church supper the household children had attended. By mid August 1965, Gertrude had begun to focus her abuse almost exclusively upon Sylvia, with her primary motivation likely being jealousy of her physical appearance and potential in life. According to subsequent trial testimony, this abuse was initially inflicted upon Sylvia after she and Jenny had returned to the Baniszewski residence from Arsenal Technical High School, as well as on weekends. This initial abuse included subjecting Likens to beatings and being refused sufficient food, which eventually led to Likens eating leftovers or spoiled food out of garbage cans. On one occasion, Likens was accused of stealing candy she had actually purchased. On another occasion, in late August, Likens was subjected to humiliation when she claimed to have a boyfriend in Long Beach, whom she had met in the spring of 1965 when her family lived in California. In response to hearing this, Gertrude asked if she had, quote, ever done anything with a boy, to which Likens replied, quote, "I guess so," and offered that she had gone skating with boys there and once went to a park on the beach with them and Jenny. Continuing the conversation with Stephanie and Jenny, Sylvia mentioned that she had once lain under the covers with her boyfriend. Upon hearing this, Gertrude asked, "Why did you do that, Sylvia?" Sylvia replied, "I don't know," and shrugged. Several days later, Gertrude returned to the subject with her, saying, "You're certainly getting big in the stomach, Sylvia. It looks like you're going to have a baby." Sylvia thought Gertrude was kidding with her and said, "Yeah, it sure is getting big. I'm just going to have to go on a diet." However, Gertrude then informed her and the other girls in the house that whenever they, quote, did something with a boy, they would be sure to have a baby. She then kicked Sylvia in the genitals, and Paula, herself overweight, 3 months pregnant, and also jealous of her physical appearance, then participated in attacking Sylvia, knocking her off her chair onto the kitchen floor, shouting, "You ain't fit to sit in a chair." On another occasion, as the family ate supper, Gertrude, Paula, and the neighborhood boy named Randy Gordon Lepper force fed Sylvia a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard, ketchup, and spices. Of course, Sylvia vomited as a result and was later forced to consume what she had regurgitated. So, if this little, prelude into this case wasn't enough, there is going to be lots of talk of abuse, among other things, towards a young Sylvia. So, if that is not what you are looking for, I do recommend that you go ahead and skip this episode and go on to a more not so disgusting case. And what would be Sylvia's only act of retaliation? She spread a rumor at her high school that Stephanie and Paula were prostitutes. She did this because she was upset with the household singling her out for similar accusations. While at school, Stephanie was jokingly propositioned by a boy who told her that Sylvia had started the rumor about her. Upon returning home that day, Stephanie questioned Sylvia about the rumor, and she admitted to starting it. Stephanie punched her in response, but Sylvia apologized to her in tears, and Stephanie then also began to cry. However, when Stephanie's boyfriend, 15-year-old Coy Randolph Hubbard, heard this rumor, he brutally attacked Sylvia, slapping her, banging her head against the wall, and flipping her backwards onto the floor. When Gertrude found out, she used the paddle to beat Sylvia. So, I don't know how people so physically abusive just seem to target one person. Like the fact that some 15-year-old boy just started attacking Sylvia is a bit much. On another occasion, Paula beat Sylvia about the face with such force that she broke her own wrist, having primarily focused her blows upon Sylvia's teeth and eyes. Later, Paula used the cast on her wrist to further beat Sylvia. Gertrude repeatedly falsely accused Sylvia of engaging in prostitution, delivering rants to Sylvia regarding the filthiness of prostitution and of women in general. Gertrude would later occasionally force Jenny to strike her own sister, beating Jenny if she did not comply. Absolutely disgusting human beings, man. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates frequently visited the Baniszewski's residence to both physically and verbally torment Sylvia, often collaborating with Baniszewski's children and Gertrude herself. With the active encouragement of Gertrude, these neighborhood children routinely beat Sylvia, sometimes using her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, lacerating her body, burning her skin with lit cigarettes in excess of 100 times, and severely injuring her genitals. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Likens was forced at one point to strip naked in the family living room. And if you're not trying to hear something profoundly disgusting, please go ahead and skip ahead about 15 seconds. Was forced to strip naked in the family living room and masturbate with a glass Pepsi Cola bottle in their presence, with Gertrude stating to all present this act of humiliation being for Sylvia to, quote, prove to Jenny what kind of a girl you are. I couldn't imagine being in this kind of environment. It's insane to me that, these kinds of people exist. Gertrude eventually forbade Sylvia from attending school after she confessed to having stolen a gym suit from the school after Gertrude had refused to purchase the clothing for her. For this act of theft, Gertrude whipped Sylvia with a 3-inch wide police belt. Gertrude then switched her conversation to the, quote, evils of premarital sex before repeatedly kicking Sylvia in the genitals as Stephanie rallied to Sylvia's defense, shouting, she didn't do anything. Gertrude then burned Sylvia's fingertips with matches before further beating her. A few days later, Gertrude repeatedly whipped Jenny with the police belt after she reportedly stole a single tennis shoe from the school to wear on her strong foot. The Likens sisters were fearful of notifying either family members or adults at their school of the increasing incidents of abuse and neglect they were enduring, as both were afraid that doing so would only worsen their predicament, which, is a reasonable response. Because honestly, it probably would have escalated to, I don't even know how it's possible, but even to a worse extent to what they're already being subjected to. Jenny, in particular, struggled against the urge to notify family members as she had been threatened by Gertrude that she would herself be abused and tortured to the same degree as her sister if she did so. Jenny was also subjected to bullying by girls in her neighborhood, in addition to occasionally being ridiculed or beaten whenever she alluded to Sylvia's situation. In July and August, both Lester and Elizabeth Likens would occasionally return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters, whenever their travel schedule afforded them the opportunity. The last occasion Lester and Elizabeth visited their daughters was in late August, and on this occasion, neither girl exhibited any visible sign of distress about their mistreatment to their parents, likely because both were in the presence of Gertrude and her children. Almost immediately after Lester and Elizabeth had left the Baniszewski household on their final visit, Gertrude turned to face Likens and stated, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia, now they're gone?" On one occasion in September, the girls encountered their older sister, Diana Shoemaker, at a local park. Both Jenny and Sylvia informed Diana as to the abuse they were enduring at the hands of their caregiver, adding that Sylvia was being specifically targeted for physical abuse, almost always for things she'd neither said nor done. Neither sister mentioned the actual address where they resided, and initially, Diana believed her sisters must be exaggerating their claims regarding the scope of their mistreatment. I mean, that makes sense. Like, the amount of abuse and like just craziness that these poor girls were being subjected to. I mean, it'd be kind of hard to believe. Several weeks prior to this occasion, Sylvia and Jenny had encountered Diana in the same park, while in the company of 11-year-old Mary Baniszewski, and Sylvia had been given a sandwich to eat when she had mentioned to her sister she was hungry. Sylvia remained silent about the matter, although Mary revealed this fact to her family in late September. In response, Gertrude accused Sylvia of engaging in gluttony before she and Paula choked and bludgeoned her. The pair then subjected Sylvia to a scalding bath to, quote, cleanse her of sin, with Gertrude grabbing Likenson's hair and repeatedly banging her head against the bath to revive her when she fainted. Sick individuals, man. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighborhood boy named Michael John Monroe phoned Arsenal Technical High School to anonymously report that a girl with open sores across her entire body was living at the Baniszewski household. As Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited 3850 East New York Street to investigate these claims. Gertrude claimed to the nurse that Sylvia had run away from her home the previous week and that she was unaware of her actual whereabouts, adding that Sylvia was, quote, out of control and that her open sores were results of her refusal to maintain decent personal hygiene. Gertrude further claimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school made no further investigations in relation to Sylvia's welfare. Come on. Like, that's the thing I don't understand. Like, you get a tip of a young child who apparently has sores all over her body, and you go to the house, and the mother just gives excuse after excuse, essentially naming her as a bad child type of thing, and they just left it alone. I know hindsight is 2020, but I don't know. Like, to me, that just seems like a bunch of red flags in front of me. The immediate neighbors of the Baniszewski family were a middle-aged couple named Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion. Both initially viewed Gertrude as an ideal caregiver for the Likens sisters, and both had visited the Baniszewski residence on 2 occasions when the girls had been under Gertrude's care. On both occasions, the Vermillions witnessed Paula physically abusing Sylvia, who on both occasions had a black eye, and openly boasting about her mistreatment of the child to them. Upon their second visit to the Baniszewski household, both observed Likens to appear extremely meek and somewhat zombified in nature. Nevertheless, the Vermillions never reported Sylvia's evident mistreatment to the authorities. They're just as bad as she is, honestly. You clearly see signs of incredible abuse and you do nothing. Like, that's just being complacent. On or about October 1st, Diana Shoemaker discovered that her sisters were temporarily residing at the Baniszewski residence. She visited the property in an attempt to initiate regular contact. Gertrude, however, refused Diana entrance to her property, stating that she had, quote, received permission from their parents not to allow either girl to see her. She then ordered Diana off her property. Approximately 2 weeks later, Diana encountered Jenny by chance close to 3850 East New York Street and inquired as to Sylvia's welfare. She was informed, I can't tell you or I'll get in trouble. This is where it's going to get really, really intense. Like, we're going into torture territory. Due to the increase in the frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment she was subjected to, Sylvia gradually became unable to control her bladder. She was denied any access to the bathroom, being forced to wet herself. Gertrude threw Sylvia into the basement and tied her up. Here, Sylvia was often kept naked, rarely fed, and frequently deprived of water. Occasionally, she was tied to the railing of the basement stairs with her feet barely touching the ground. In the weeks prior to locking Sylvia in the family basement, Gertrude had increasingly abused and tormented Sylvia. She would occasionally falsely claim to the children in her household that either she herself or one of them had been the recipient of direct insults from Sylvia in the hope this would goad them into belittling or attacking her. On one occasion, Gertrude held a knife aloft and challenged Sylvia to, quote, fight her back, to which Sylvia replied she did not know how to fight. In response, Gertrude inflicted a small wound to Sylvia's leg. Physical and mental torment such as this was occasionally ceased by the Baniszewskis to watch their favorite television shows. Neighborhood children were also occasionally charged 5 cents apiece to see the display of Sylvia's body and to humiliate, beat, scald, burn, and ultimately mutilate her. Throughout the period of Likens' captivity in the basement, Gertrude frequently, with the assistance of her children and neighborhood children, restrained Sylvia before placing her in a bathtub filled with scalding water, before proceeding to rub salt into her wounds. In order to muffle Sylvia's screams, her tormentors would regularly place a cloth gag in her mouth as they tortured her. On one occasion, Gertrude and her 12-year-old son, John Jr., rubbed urine and feces from Gertrude's 1-year-old son's diaper into Sylvia's mouth before giving her a cup half filled with water and stating the water was all she would receive for the remainder of the day. On October 22nd, John Baniszewski Jr. tormented Sylvia by offering to allow her to eat a bowl of soup with her fingers and then quickly taking away the bowl when Sylvia, by this stage, suffering from extreme malnourishment, attempted to eat the food. Gertrude eventually allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs on the condition that she learned not to wet herself. That night, Sylvia whispered to Jenny to secretly give her a glass of water before falling asleep. The following morning, Gertrude discovered that Sylvia had urinated herself, and as a punishment, Likens was forced to insert an empty glass Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina in the presence of the Baniszewski children before Gertrude ordered her into the basement. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude shouted for Likens to return to the kitchen and ordered her to strip naked before proclaiming to her, quote, "You have branded my daughters. Now I'm going to brand you." She began carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," onto Sylvia's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to finish the branding, she instructed one of the neighborhood children present, 14-year-old Richard Dean Hobbs, to finish etching the words into Sylvia's flesh as she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. In what Hobbs would later insist were short, light etchings, he continued to brand the text into Sylvia's abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Both Hobbs and 10-year-old Shirley Baniszewski then led Likens into the basement, where each proceeded to use an anchor bolt and attempt to burn the letter S beneath Sylvia's left breast, although they applied one section of the loop backwards, and this deep burn scar would resemble the numeral 3. It's just the fact that Gertrude is getting these young, like children to do this kind of stuff is like disgusting. I can't. Gertrude later taunted Sylvia by claiming she would never be able to marry due to the words carved on her stomach, stating, "Sylvia, what are you going to do now? You can't get married. What are you going to do?" Weeping, Sylvia replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do." She was then carried back to the basement by Coy Hubbard, and later that day, Sylvia was forced to display the carving to neighborhood children, with Gertrude claiming she had received the inscription at a sex party. That night, Sylvia confided to her sister, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." The following day, Gertrude woke Sylvia, then forced her to write a letter she dictated the contents. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Sylvia after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted the extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Likens had written this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and leave her there to die. After she had finished writing this letter, Sylvia was then again tied to the stair railing and offered crackers to eat, although she refused them, saying, "Give it to the dog. I don't want it." In response, Gertrude forced the crackers into Sylvia's mouth before she and John beat her, particularly around the stomach. On October 25th, Likens attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing a conversation between Gertrude and John Baniszewski Jr. pertaining to the family's plan to abandon her to die. She attempted to flee to the front door. However, due to her extensive injuries and general weakness, Gertrude caught her before she could escape the property. Sylvia was then given toast to eat but was unable to consume the food due to her extreme state of dehydration. Gertrude forced the toast into her mouth before repeatedly striking her face with a curtain rod until sections of the instrument were bent into right angles. Coy Hubbard then took the curtain rod from Gertrude and struck Sylvia one further time, rendering her unconscious. Gertrude then dragged Sylvia into the basement. That evening, Likens desperately attempted to alert neighbors by screaming for help and hitting the walls of the basement with a spade. One immediate neighbor of the Baniszewskis would later inform police she had heard the desperate commotion and that she had identified the source as emanating from the basement, but that as the noise had suddenly ceased at approximately 3 a.m., she decided not to inform police about the disturbance. That is ridiculous. Like, you hear somebody screaming bloody murder coming from a basement of your neighbor's house till at least 3 a.m. and you don't report it after it stops. It's ridiculous. By the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to either speak intelligibly or to correctly coordinate the movement of her limbs. Gertrude did move Sylvia into the kitchen, having propped her back against the wall, attempt to feed her a donut and a glass of milk, although she threw Sylvia to the floor in frustration when she was unable to correctly move the glass of milk to her lips. She was then returned to the basement. Shortly thereafter, Sylvia became delirious, repeatedly moaning and mumbling. When Paula asked her to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia was unable to recite anything but beyond the first four letters, or to raise herself off the ground. Gertrude then ordered Sylvia, who had defecated, to clean herself. That afternoon, several of Sylvia's other tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia jerkingly moved her arms in an apparent attempt to point at the faces of the tormentors she could recognize, making statements such as, "You're Ricky, you're Gertie," before Gertrude shouted, "Shut up, you know who I am." Minutes later, Sylvia unsuccessfully attempted to bite into a rotten pear she had been given to eat, stating she could feel the looseness in her teeth. Upon hearing this, Jen replied, "Don't you remember, Sylvia? Your front tooth was knocked out when you were 7. Jenny then left Sylvia in the basement to perform gardening chores for neighbors in the hope of earning spending money. In an attempt to wash Sylvia, a laughing John Baniszewski Jr. sprayed her with a garden hose brought to the house that afternoon by Randy Lepper at Gertrude's request. Sylvia again desperately attempted to exit the basement but collapsed before she could reach the stairs. In response to this effort, Gertrude stomped on Sylvia's head before standing and staring at her for several moments. Stephanie then decided to give Sylvia a warm, soapy bath. Although Sylvia ceased breathing before she could be carried out of the basement, she was 16 years old. When Stephanie realized that Sylvia was not breathing, she attempted to apply mouth to mouth resuscitation as Gertrude repeatedly shouted her belief to the children and teenagers present in her house that Sylvia was faking her death. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Baniszewski residence and immediately proceeded to the basement. He slipped on the wet basement stairs and fell heavily to the floor of the basement to be confronted with the sight of Stephanie crying and cuddling Sylvia's emaciated and lacerated body. Gertrude initially accused Sylvia of feigning death. She struck her body with a book, shouting, "Faker, faker," to rouse her. Then, panicking, instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When police arrived at her address at approximately 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's emaciated, extensively bludgeoned, and mutilated body lying upon a soiled mattress in one of the bedrooms. Before handing them the letter she had forced Sylvia to previously write to her dictation, also claiming she had been, quote, doctoring the child for an hour or more prior to her death, having applied rubbing alcohol to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid before she died. She added that Sylvia had earlier ran away from home with several teenage boys before returning to her house earlier that afternoon, bare-breasted and clutching the note. Clutching a Bible, Paula Baniszewski, having stated to all present in the household that Sylvia's death was, quote, meant to happen, then glanced in Jenny's direction and calmly stated, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." As previously instructed by Gertrude, Jenny Likens recited the rehearsed version of events leading to Sylvia's death shortly after 5:30 p.m. that afternoon to police, before whispering to the officers, "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The formal statement provided by Jenny Likens prompted officers to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Baniszewski Jr. on suspicion of Likens' murder within hours of the discovery of her body. The same day, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same offenses. The three eldest children, plus Coy Hubbard, were placed in the custody of a nearby juvenile detention center, and the younger children and Richard Hobbs were detained at the Indianapolis Children's Guardians Home. All were held without bail pending trial. Initially, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia's death, although by October 27th, she had confessed to having known the kids, particularly her daughter Paula and Coy Hubbard, had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia, stating that Paula did most of the damage and that Coy Hubbard did a lot of the beating. Gertrude further admitted to having forced the girl to sleep in the basement on approximately 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. She became evasive when one officer stated the likely reasons Sylvia had become incontinent were her mental distress and injury to her kidneys. Lacking any remorse, Paula signed a statement admitting having repeatedly beaten Sylvia about the backside with her mother's police belt, also once breaking her wrist on Sylvia's jaw and inflicting other acts of brutality, including pushing her down the stairs into the basement 2 or 3 times and inflicting a black eye. John Jr. admitted to having, quote, spanked Sylvia on one occasion, adding that, quote, most of the time I used my fists to abuse her. He admitted to having burned Sylvia with matches on several occasions, adding that his mother had repeatedly burned the child with cigarettes. 5 other neighborhood children who had participated in Sylvia's abuse, Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Cisco, had also been arrested by October 29th. All were charged with causing injury to person, and each was subsequently released into the custody of their parents upon subpoena to appear as witnesses at the upcoming trial. The autopsy of Sylvia's body revealed she had suffered an excess of 150 separate wounds across her entire body, in addition to being extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The wounds themselves varied in location, nature, severity, and the actual stage of healing. Her injuries included burns, severe bruising, and extensive muscle and nerve damage. Her vaginal cavity was almost swollen shut, although an examination of the canal determined that her hymen was still intact, discrediting Gertrude's assertions Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant, a prostitute, and promiscuous. Moreover, all of Sylvia's fingernails were broken backwards, and most of the external layers of skin upon the child's face, breast, neck, and right knee had peeled or receded. In her death throes, Sylvia had evidently bitten through her lips, partially severing sections of them from her face. The official cause of Sylvia's death was listed by coroner Dr. Arthur Keble as a subdural hematoma due to her receiving a severe blow to her right temple. Both the shock she had primarily suffered due to severe and prolonged damage inflicted to her skin, plus the severe malnutrition, were listed as contributory factors to her death. Rigor mortis had fully developed at the time of the discovery of her body, indicating Sylvia may have been deceased for up to 8 hours before she was found. Although Dr. Keble did note Sylvia had been recently bathed, possibly after death, and that this act could have hastened the loss of body temperature and thus speeding the onset of rigor mortis. On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude and two of her three oldest children, Paula and John Baniszewski Jr. Also indicted were Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard. All were charged with having repeatedly struck, beaten, kicked, and otherwise inflicting a culmination of fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. 3 weeks prior to the filing of the indictments against the five defendants, Stephanie Baniszewski had been released from custody upon a right of habeas corpus bond, which, if you don't know, is a law challenging the reasons or conditions of a person's confinement under color of law. With her attorney successfully contending the state had insufficient evidence to support any murder or culmination of fatal injuries charges against her, Stephanie waived her immunity from any potential impending prosecution while agreeing to testify against her family and any other individuals charged with abusing and murdering Sylvia. At a formal pre-trial hearing held on March 16, 1966, several psychiatrists testified before Judge Saul Isaac Rabb as to their conclusions regarding psychiatric evaluations they had conducted upon three individuals indicted upon Sylvia's murder. These experts testified that all three were mentally competent to stand trial. So the trial of Gertrude, her children Paula and John, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard began on April 18th, 1966. All were tried together before Judge Rabb at Indianapolis City County Building. Initial jury selection began on this day and continued for several days. The prosecution consisted of Leroy K. New and Marjorie Wessner, who announced their intention to seek the death penalty for all five defendants on April 16th. They also successfully argued before Judge Rabb that all the defendants should be tried together, as they were ultimately charged with acting in concert in their collective crimes against Sylvia, and that as such, if each were tried separately, neither judge nor jury could hear testimony relating to a total picture of the culmination of offenses committed. Each prospective juror was questioned by counsels for both prosecution and defense in relation to their opinions regarding capital punishment being a just penalty for first-degree murder and whether a mother was actually responsible for the deportment of her children. Jurors who expressed any opposition to the death penalty were excused from duty by Leroy New. Any who either worked with children, expressed prejudice against an insanity defense, or repulsion regarding the actual horrific nature of Likens' death were excused by defense counsels. Gertrude was defended by William Erbecker. Her daughter Paula was defended by George Rice. Richard Hobbs was defended by James G. Netter. John Baniszewski Jr. and Coy Hubbard were defended by Forrest Bowman. The attorneys for Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, Paula, and John claimed they had been pressured into participating in Sylvia's torment, abuse, and torture. Gertrude herself pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Such a cop-out, dude. The trial of the five defendants lasted 17 days before the jury retired to consider its verdict. On May 19th, 1966, after deliberating for 8 hours, the panel of 8 men and 4 women found Gertrude guilty of first-degree murder, recommending a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula Baniszewski was found guilty of second-degree murder, and Hobbs, Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing Judge Rabb pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children burst into tears and attempted to console each other as Hobbs and Hubbard remained impassive. On May 25th, Gertrude and Paula were formally sentenced to life imprisonment. The same day, Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski Jr. each received sentences of 2 to 21 years to be served in the Indiana Reformatory. In September 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the convictions of Gertrude and Paula on the basis that Judge Saul Isaac Rabb had denied repeatedly submitted motions by their defense and counsel at the original trial for both a change of venue and separate trials. This ruling further stated that the circumstances regarding the prejudicial atmosphere created during their initial trial due to the extensive news media publicity surrounding the case impeded any chance of either appellant receiving a fair trial. The pair were retried in 1971. On this occasion, Paula opted to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than face a retrial. She was sentenced to serve a term of between 2 and 20 years imprisonment for her part in Sylvia's abuse and death. Despite twice unsuccessfully having attempted to escape from prison in 1971, she was released in December 1972. And Gertrude, however, was again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Over the course of the following 14 years, Gertrude became known as a model prisoner at the Indiana Women's Prison. She worked in the prison sewing shop and was known as somewhat of a den mother to younger female inmates, becoming known to some within the prison by the nickname Mom. By the time of Gertrude's ultimate parole, in 1985, she had changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, a combination of her middle name and maiden name, and described herself as a devout Christian. Yeah, no, sorry. After the crazy shit you did to Sylvia, you don't get that luxury, in my opinion. News of Gertrude's impending parole hearing created an uproar throughout Indiana. Jenny Likens and other immediate family members of Sylvia vehemently protested against any prospect of her release. Members of two anti-crime groups also traveled to Indiana to oppose Baniszewski's potential parole and to publicly support this Likens family. Members of both groups initiated a sidewalk picket campaign. Over the course of 2 months, these groups collected over 40,000 signatures from the citizens of Indiana, including signatures obtained from outraged citizens too young to recollect the case. All signatures gathered demanded that Gertrude remain incarcerated for the remainder of her life. Within her parole hearing, Gertrude stated her wish that Sylvia's death could, quote, be undone, although she minimized her responsibility for any of her actions, stating, quote, I'm not sure what role I had in Sylvia's death because I was on drugs. I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for whatever happened to Sylvia. You're a sick individual. You did this obscene, grotesque, disgusting things to this 16-year-old girl. And you have the gall to say you're a devout Christian and that you don't remember it. I was on drugs. It's such a bad thing that happened. I wish it could be undone. Nah, it's not going to be undone. You did what you did, you disgusting human being, and you should be in prison for all of your life that you have left. And the fact that she did eventually get out on parole in 1985 and lived out the rest of her life is crazy to me. I don't understand how somebody like this could be allowed to be entered back into society. I really don't. Following her 1985 release from prison, Gertrude relocated to Iowa. She never accepted full responsibility for Sylvia's prolonged torment and death, insisting she was unable to precisely recall any of her actions in the month of Sylvia's prolonged and increasing abuse and torment within her home. She primarily blamed her actions upon the medication she had been prescribed to treat her asthma, and Gertrude lived in relative obscurity in Laurel, Iowa, until her death due to lung cancer on June 16th, 1990, at the age of 61. And that, unfortunately, is the just insane, sad case of Sylvia Likens. I'd like to take this time to shout out Sylvia's Child Advocacy Center. It was founded in 2010 in Lebanon, Indiana, and initially named the Boone County Child Advocacy Center. It's a nonprofit organization, and it was renamed in Sylvia's honor in 2016, with the executive director stating, "The most important thing that we can do is tell kids they are hurt and we are listening." This was something no one did for young Sylvia. Her family is thankful, though it doesn't have to be that way anymore. She did not die in vain. She died a horrific death, but because of that, we're hoping that another child can be saved. All in all, at least Sylvia's death can be used to hopefully try and save children from anything like this happening to them. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to support us, please consider sharing this episode. You can also check out our Patreon, where you can subscribe for $5 a month and get some exclusive benefits, such as 15% off our online store and get a Patreon exclusive episode at the end of every month. You can find us at patreon.com/whatsleeppodcast. Thank you, and we hope to see you in the next episode.